Howdy, and welcome to another episode of Farmers Fight. Last time, we began working our way through the Reconstruction era, beginning in 1863 with wartime Reconstruction and ending with Andrew Johnson's rise to the presidency in April 1865. Today, we will stay within that same general time frame, but slightly shift our focus to free labor ideology and the advent of sharecropping and tenant farming in the South. Both systems of agriculture have existed in many societies around the world and bear some resemblance to European feudal arrangements like land tenure. In many ways, sharecropping and tenantry arose out of emancipation. The social and economic upheavals caused by freeing the South's plantation workforce led lawmakers, industrialists, and financial interests to pressure the now freed peoples to return to the plantations from which they were just liberated. This was done largely to feed domestic and international markets, but also to restore a semblance of order. Because the plight of sharecroppers and tenant farmers was integral to the formation of Southern farmers' organizations, I think it is necessary to take a look at how both systems arose. As always, you can check out the sources I am using for this show by going to farmersfightpodcast.com. You can also leave a comment or send me an email or even drop some change in the jar. Thanks for listening. On with the show. Episode 4, Sharecropping and the Church of Free Labor. Walt Whitman once said that the essence of history, philosophy, art, and even the personal character of all future Americans would be traced back to the Civil War. I ran across this quote at least twice during my research, but perhaps you can see why it's so popular. The war certainly had wide-ranging effects on American society, but in the war's immediate aftermath, the social and economic arrangements that took shape in the South would have some of the longest-lasting impacts on the country's agrarian classes. As we briefly touched on last episode, the nation possessed distinct regional economies early in its history. In the post-war period, these economies could be broken down to three basic occupational groups: farmers, who made up the majority of the nation's workforce, followed by urban workers and the various owning and commercial classes. These groups all played a significant role in the emerging industrial state of the pre-war era, but farmers and urban workers particularly were forced to renegotiate their relationship with the new social and economic regime of the post-war era, one that was heavily influenced by corporations. Similarly, the new freed black population had to renegotiate its role as freed people in a country that was largely hostile, or at best indifferent to their plight. At the end of the war, the two biggest questions on the nation's mind were what would be the role of blacks in social and political life, and what sort of labor system should replace slavery. Plantation slavery never dominated the entire South as it had done in, say, the West Indies. Instead, the bulk of slaves and productive land were concentrated in the plantation or the Black Belt of the southeastern United States. Just as an aside, Black Belt refers to the soil in the region, but later became synonymous with black labor on those regional plantations. Prior to the war, the wealth produced by this region gave rise to a ruling class that shaped the political and social institutions of the South, largely to serve their own interests. This oligarchic class of Southern planters was generally hated, or at least despised, by the small independent yeomanry and the poor landless whites of the region, two groups that we're going to talk more about next episode. But in the wake of emancipation, disillusion of the great plantations as well as the economic system of slavery, Southern society was cast adrift, left to renegotiate new economic and social realities in the ruins of the Old South. Vested interest in the North wanted Southern cotton production to resume as quickly as possible, but the chaos caused by occupying Union troops, coupled with the mass migration of newly emancipated peoples who were often searching for family, economic opportunities, or simply trying to escape their immediate environments, led Southern politicians to focus on getting the freedmen, quote, under control. Speaking in reference to Northern political opinions on this matter, the then governor of Texas, James Throckmorton, observed, quote, "I do believe we will be enabled to adopt a coercive system of labor." This brings us to one of this episode's main topics, sharecropping, and tenant farming. But before we get into the weeds, we should define what these terms mean. Sharecropping in the American context refers to a system of agricultural production where a farmer rented a plot of land from a landowner as well as the needed supplies to raise a crop. The renter, or the cropper, lived on the land but was also dependent on additional provisions from local merchants who often furbished items like food and other farming supplies on credit. At harvest time, the landowner would take a larger share of the crop than the renter, who often received something like 1/3 or 1/2 of the crop, depending on their contract. The cropper would use his share to settle all outstanding balances with the local merchant. Anything left over was considered a profit. So in short, sharecropping was a system that viewed the renter as a self-directed employee, but with more supervision from the landowner than, say, a tenant farmer. Tenantry was similar to the cropping system, but it differed in several key ways. The tenant was considered something more akin to a foreman who was overseeing agricultural production, meaning he received little to no oversight from the landowner. He used his own tools and animals and may or may not have lived on the premises. Like the sharecropper, the tenant farmer paid debts with his share of that season's crop yield, but usually he received a larger share than your average cropper. It all sounds pretty simple and straightforward, but the devil is in the details. These two systems arose in response to the economic chaos of the war-torn South and were influenced by the North's ideology of free labor. At the outset of the war, the northern middle classes, influenced by a surge of patriotism and bolstered by the Protestant Church, embraced an abolitionist stance. For W.E.B. Du Bois, a majority in the North did not want to free the enslaved out of a moral duty to Christian or constitutional ideals. Rather, they sought to reduce impediments to trade and wealth creation. Abolition was framed in practical economic terms as much as it was framed in moral and ethical ones. The Republican Party, now facing a depleted Congress thanks to secession, also joined in support of abolition, but with an emphasis on the supremacy of free labor ideology over chattel slavery. Though the concept of free labor was contemporary with chattel slavery, it was not a reference to the bondage or wageless work of the South. The free and free labor referred to notions of independence and self-reliance that were seen as crucial to dignified work. It also emphasized an egalitarian vision of the individual and the idea that anyone could become a success through hard work and dedication. Such confidence in individual potential drew on the religious milieu of the pre-war era, best embodied by the Protestant revivalism of the Second Great Awakening. At the same time, similar notions of self-reliance were being espoused by transcendentalist philosophers like Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. But to understand how sharecropping took root, no pun intended, we have to go back to 1861 and Abraham Lincoln's framing of the Civil War within the context of free labor ideology versus Southern slavery. Lincoln insisted that slavery embodied the idea that a worker's condition was fixed forever. He contrasted this with the free labor system of the North, saying that, quote, men with their families work for themselves, on their farms, in their houses, and in their shops, taking the whole product to themselves and asking no favors of capital on the one hand, nor hired laborers or slaves on the other. In his own way, Lincoln was invoking imagery similar to Thomas Jefferson's concept of the idealized small and independent yeoman farmer, free of market forces and in control of his own destiny. Free labor rhetoric was strengthened by the Union's victory over the Confederacy, and confirmed to many what Frederick Douglass termed the higher civilization of the North. The idea that wage labor was superior to Southern slavery in its ability to raise the status of an individual to that of an independent farmer or craftsman was attractive and authentic enough for most rural citizens in the North that it would become a starting point for the post-war South. But free labor was not based on humanitarian feelings. It was more political and economic. As a Maryland Unionist noted in 1864, it must be a source of mortification that emancipation has not been for higher principles, but party spirit, vengeful feelings against disloyal slaveholders, and a regard for material interests. There has been no expression, at least in this community, of regard for the enslaved, for human rights, but many expressive of the great prosperity to result to the states by a change of the system of labor. As the former governor of North Carolina said in 1865, quote, "With reference to emancipation, we are at the beginning of the war." The abolition of slavery presented new opportunities and a bucket of challenges to the nation's black population in nearly every aspect of social and economic life. In 1863, the New York Times said that if slaves are actually freed, quote, "there will come the further duty of making them work. All of this opens a vast and most difficult subject." Such opinions were common among Southern and Northern populations, but there was reason to question the willingness of former slaves to return to conditions not unlike those they had just been liberated from, but now with the inducement of money. To Northern investors and Union generals, the system of free labor simply meant that freed blacks would return to the plantation, but as wage laborers working under improved conditions. But to newly freed people, free labor meant farming their own land and living largely independent of the marketplace, not unlike the white yeomanry. In a meeting with black leaders in Savannah, Georgia, Baptist minister Garrison Frazier, himself a slave for 60 years before purchasing his own freedom, told Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton that freedom meant, quote, "placing us where we could reap the fruits of our own labor." Aside from seeing freedom as meaning control over their own labor, freedmen refused to work harder than they had as slaves. As one freedman put it, they would not be driven into the fields 2 hours before daybreak and let go at 9 or 10 in the evening. In 1865, Henry Adams told his former master that, quote, "I see how the poor white people do. I ought to do so too, or else I am a slave." But mostly freedmen desired land ownership and felt that 250 years of, quote, "their past labor entitled them to at least a portion of their own estates." Land ownership also meant autonomy and agency, both in a self-directed as well as an economic sense. In short, they wanted to be self-sufficient and autonomous in as much the same way as the independent yeoman. The same enthusiasm for land ownership can be seen in other post-emancipatory societies, such as Haiti, the Caribbean, and Brazil. All freedmen in those societies saw land ownership as key to economic independence and a way to avoid plantation labor. As an example, a northern cotton manufacturer representative named A. Warren Kelsey remarked, "The sole ambition of the freedman at the present time appears to be to become the owner of a little piece of land, there to erect a humble home, and to dwell in peace and security at his own free will and pleasure." But the key difference between other slave societies in the American South was that African Americans were convinced that the federal government had committed itself to land redistribution. While some did achieve personal independence through land ownership, the few experiments in land redistribution would prove to have less than positive results across the former Confederate states. Since Southern planters and freedmen were unable to come to an agreement as to what free labor meant to the individual, the victorious North tried to impart its own understanding of what a transition from slavery to freed labor would look like. The creation of the Army's Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands in March of 1865, better known as the Freedmen's Bureau, epitomized the belief that the federal government must help emancipated slaves integrate into the new social ecology. Initially authorized for 1 year under the Lincoln administration, the Bureau was to act as midwife at the birth of free labor in the South. It was tasked with introducing a workable system of wage labor, distributing aid such as clothes and food, adjudicating disputes between blacks and whites, providing education, protecting freedmen from violence and coercive discipline, and dividing abandoned and confiscated lands into 40-acre plots for rental and eventual sale. As part of establishing a working labor system, the Bureau found its interests aligned with those of the planters, meaning the best place for freedmen was back on the plantation. Bureau agents insisted that male heads of household sign labor contracts for their entire families, But in many respects, this was a naive miscalculation on part of the Bureau, who believed that the interests of capital and labor were identical. Chief Commissioner of the Bureau, General Oliver Howard, agreed that freedmen should return to laboring on plantations, but under conditions that allowed them to elevate themselves above the wage-earning class. For Bureau agents and advocates of free labor, all that was needed to be done was to have blacks and whites simply drop their previous attitudes towards labor, and the market would take care of the rest. Obviously easier said than done. But fair wages could not be paid for fair work in such a hostile social climate, as pre-war animosities and prejudices were not easily suppressed. Many freedmen lobbied the Bureau for lack of payment, as poor harvests generally meant lower wages or no payment at all. The planters were just not in the business of respecting labor contracts they had agreed to, especially if returns were poor. Both the freedmen and planters quickly realized that each had inherited the attitudes and work habits of slavery that was plainly at odds with a free labor system. The Bureau, and eventually Northern society, came to this conclusion as well, albeit a bit slower. But the draw of free labor wasn't working for a wage. It was the promise of economic mobility through acquiring property. Commissioner Howard, himself a supporter of the Radical Republicans and a part-time advisor to Andrew Johnson, took the role of resettling freedmen on confiscated and abandoned land seriously. In 1865, the Bureau controlled 850,000 acres of abandoned land, far from enough to settle every freed family, but enough to seed a black yeomanry. The federal government's attempt to create a black yeomanry began early in the war. When Port Royal, South Carolina was captured by the U.S. Navy in 1861, approximately 10,000 freed slaves on the Sea Islands of South Carolina tore down the cotton gins and sacked the large houses. They began planting corn and potatoes for subsistence and refused to grow cotton. This sort of self-emancipatory homesteading was cut short by a host of Northern interventionists, ranging from military officers, government officials, abolitionists, but mostly Northern land speculators who sought to privatize the former plantations and turn former slaves into paid workers. This blend of humanitarian reformism and blatant opportunism is exampled by a consortium of Boston investors from textile firms and a railroad company. Having purchased a sizable portion of land at Port Royal, the group sought to demonstrate how the end of slavery did not mean the end of cotton production. Basing their experiment on free labor ideology, a representative of the group named Edward Philbrick sought to apply the notion that blacks must work to accrue the necessary value to purchase land. He and his fellow investors did not think the proposal to sell freedmen land at under market value was worth 250 years of bondage, but I digress. Though seemingly lucrative, most efforts to repurpose plantation lands and recast former slaves as wage workers was not lucrative enough for Northern industrialists to jump in with both feet. Philbrick himself called it quits in 1865. He subdivided the land and sold it to the laborers who were still more interested in self-sufficiency than wage labor. While this experiment did not necessarily achieve its intended goal, it did have positive outcomes for the Port Royal freedmen. But their successes were the exception in the post-war South rather than the norm. Somewhat ironically, the largest experiment in alternatives to enforced wage labor occurred at Davis Bend, Mississippi, the former plantation of Joseph Davis and his brother, Confederate President Jefferson Davis. Before the war, the brothers had attempted to develop what they called a model slave community, which involved better housing and health conditions and an extraordinary degree of self-governance. The brothers were sufficiently progressive in this regard, enough so that it enhanced their reputation among slaves in the area, some of whom pressed for Jefferson's release from prison after the war, noting he tried hard to keep them enslaved but showed them much kindness in the pre-war years. Their system also garnered sufficient mockery from other planters, who were deeply threatened by what some called Joe Davis's freed Negroes. Once the Union Army took control of Davis Bend in 1863, General Ulysses S. Grant determined that the plantation should become, quote, a Negro paradise, resolving to turn the land over to the freedmen for settlement. By 1865, the experiment at Davis Bend appeared to be a resounding success. That year, the community earned $160,000 in profit, which comes out to around $2.5 million in today's dollars. But however successful, the model of black self-governance would not become the norm in the New South. But projects like that at Davis Bend would help pave the way for sharecropping, as the ultimate desire for freedmen was to oversee their own labor. Events in southern Louisiana paint a far more common picture of the plight of the freedmen in the early years of Reconstruction. Unlike their peers at Port Royal and Davis Bend, southern Louisiana retained a large portion of its planter elite due to their status as loyal Unionists. This was a product of their heavy reliance on federal subsidies in the pre-war years and a desire to retain their properties following the war. These planters influenced the occupying Union Army to order freedmen back to the plantation, something that Union General Nathaniel Banks thought would stabilize the state's economy and relieve the military of caring for black refugees. He hoped by restoring a semblance of order he could spur the state's white population to support a free state movement. In 1863, General Banks issued a set of labor regulations that were criticized for their seeming draconian nature. Banks was in line with the language specified by Lincoln's 10% plan that instructed states to adopt temporary measures regarding the management of their black populations that were, quote, consistent with their present condition as a laboring, homeless, and landless class. His plan was also in line with the desire of Southern leaders and former plantation owners who wanted laborers back in the fields to avoid vagrancy and idleness, but also to take advantage of high cotton prices. The Army's general idea was to keep as many freedmen as possible working in the countryside, but also to educate the worker and employer in the new system of wage labor. This tended to mean that necessities that were supplied to laborers such as food, clothes, and shelter under slavery now became commodities which required payment under the free labor system. The program of compulsory labor contracts also served to keep the plantation system functioning. Without military enforcement, the model of large landed estates producing a single cotton crop for the world market would quickly fall apart, as it was not attractive to most under the free labor system. Without slaves or forced labor contracts, the plantation model was dead on arrival. Banks's terms can be viewed either as an attempt to restore civil order or a shrewd tactic to gain the support of powerful planters and white Louisianans. Whatever the case, freed blacks were not enthusiastic supporters of the military's program. Many labored irregularly and devoted most of their time to growing food for their own sustenance. Under the direction of Bureau Chief General Howard and his supporting directors, the Bureau attempted to make the land in their possession available to freedmen. Under Circular No. 13, a part of Special Field Order No. 15, Howard attempted to create 40-acre homesteads along with provisions needed to facilitate, and I'm partially quoting here, faithful industry where they can readily achieve independence. But this was quashed by President Andrew Johnson, who directed Howard to rescind the order and restore confiscated lands to pardoned ex-Confederates, including those within the Sherman Reservation. Johnson eventually removed General Rufus Saxton from his post in Georgia, Florida, and the Sea Islands of South Carolina for similar reasons. Johnson's move effectively ended the Bureau's program of encouraging black land ownership. The retraction of a major promise by the federal government was not received well by the freedmen. Tens of thousands were removed from their lands, including those in Louisiana, the Sea Islands, and Davis Bend. One freedman asserted that should their lands be restored to the planters, then the freedmen would be in a worse condition than under slavery and were not truly free. As a third way, many freedmen begged Howard to let them rent lands or purchase lands, attesting that labor contracts were akin to slavery. In the end, only about 2,000 freedmen in Georgia and South Carolina were able to obtain the lands they were promised. This left freedmen without much in the way of metaphorical bootstraps with which to pull themselves up. For the majority of ex-slaves, it was a choice between signing labor contracts with their former masters or vacating the plantation in search of better opportunities, which were sharply limited to the freedmen. Many bureau agents viewed the forced labor contracts as an imperfect solution, but one that was temporary. They believed this arrangement would give way to a rational and just free labor system. But the economic disorder following emancipation had further entrenched the idea in most Southern whites that management of black labor was the only solution to restoring stability. In the eyes of the plantation owners, the refusal of black laborers to work under the conditions dictated to them by their employers was proof of the iniquities of free labor ideology, and confirmation that blacks would never work efficiently without corporal punishment or direct oversight. But unsurprisingly, most blacks were more concerned with seizing upon personal freedoms or reuniting broken families rather than laboring in the fields. Both planters and the federal government did not consider that many freedmen were illiterate, suffering from some level of post-traumatic stress, and unprepared for a world of legal contracts. Despite inefficiencies, yearly labor contracts would carry over into the post-war policy of the Army and Freedmen's Bureau, while unintentionally setting the stage for the rise of sharecropping. Such a system came to be a part of what is known as the Black Codes, which were laws passed by state legislatures that restricted the freedmen's basic rights and compelled them to return to the agricultural sector. However, hundreds of freedmen refused to sign contracts and leave the plantation, insisting that, quote, the property which the planters hold was nearly all earned by the sweat of our brow, as a black convention member in Alabama put it. Others were able to obtain land through squatting in lightly populated states like Florida and Texas, but this too was the exception, as most blacks emerged from slavery unable to buy land even at depressed prices. Even less were able to secure loans from a white society unwilling to extend credit, let alone sell them property. Without hope of land ownership, many freedmen were forced to become wage workers. Although it was not what they had originally wanted, many welcomed the free market over the paternalism of slavery. With wages, they were at least able to purchase luxuries like cheese and new clothes, as well as build churches and schools in their communities. They also learned to use the system of free labor to their advantage, be it through collective bargaining, strikes, or simply moving to another employer. But if a labor shortage in the immediate post-war years bolstered their ability to bargain, successive crop failures weakened it. The tactic of agitating for better wages was something of an anathema to white employers, who believed that they alone should determine the value of labor. Many Northerners felt that white Southerners just didn't understand free labor, while Southerners felt that their critics didn't understand the freedmen, as they insisted that they were not capable of self-management. Eventually, many Northern investors who bought Southern plantations directly after the war took on the same view of the freedmen as their Southern peers. The stereotype of an indolent lower class incapable of disciplined work goes back to pre-industrial Europe and America, where white lower classes were castigated as waste people and white trash. Accusations of idleness were also directed at those unwilling to work for anybody but themselves. Many freedmen fit this definition, expressing a desire to cultivate their own land as independent farmers rather than work as wage laborers. Thus, planters across the South realized that controlling black labor meant maintaining their hold on the most productive land in the plantation belt. The practice of not renting or selling land to freedmen soon took root amongst the majority of planters. To them, they believed that the freedmen had yet to learn that freedom and independence were two separate issues. Labor contracts were often attempts to reinstitute previous working conditions such as gang labor and sun-up-to-sundown schedules. This also included policing behavior outside of working hours, such as the right to travel and hold meetings. As you might have guessed, conflicts over these issues were more than common. Around 1866 and 67, freedmen demanded improvements in their economic conditions, including greater autonomy over their own work. Many refused to carry out certain tasks like dredging canals and rice fields, which resulted in planters just turning to Irish immigrants. Around this time, the system of gang labor, which usually meant a group of unrelated men, but sometimes a family working together, was on its way out. This was in part due to a lack of capital on behalf of planters, but largely thanks to general opposition to the practice by freedmen. The further decentralization of farm labor helped pave the way for sharecropping, as freedmen were more interested in working with their own relatives in an unsupervised environment than laboring in gang conditions with oppressive oversight. Before sharecropping was firmly established, various types of labor arrangements took shape in the early years of Reconstruction, with some existing on the same plantation simultaneously. Some entailed cash wages, either paid monthly or in one lump sum at the end of the year. Others allowed laborers to own a share of the crop and receive payment based on what it was worth at harvest time. Time sharing was preferred by some since it allowed the freedmen to split their time between commercial production and their own subsistence crops. Despite this jumble of labor agreements, the majority of freedmen were engaged in some type of shared wages, meaning their pay was tied to the value of the crop at the year's end. The share would sometimes be paid out collectively for the freedmen to divide amongst themselves. The laborer's share, however, was pretty low, somewhere around 10% of the profits in many cases. The practice of year-end payments largely favored the employer, as the arrangement acted as a sort of interest-free credit on labor. This system did not require cash on hand to pay workers in a periodic fashion and allowed the employer to fluctuate their final payments to laborers depending on the profitability of the crop. This transferred much of the risk from the employer to the employee, since laborers could be left penniless in the event of a poor crop yield. Moreover, laborers would become indebted to the planter, who would bill them for rations and other necessities that would exceed their final wages. In addition to these new arrangements, the freedmen's desire for autonomy and resistance to older methods of plantation labor helped to foster the emerging sharecropping system. Sharecropping began to take form in labor contracts signed by individual families. Rather than working in gang conditions on a massive plantation, the family would be responsible for a specific piece of land, a subdivision of the larger plantation. A share of the year's crop was often the method of payment, but the freedman's final profit depended on the supplies purchased from the planter over the course of the year. The system of sharecropping spread across the South at differing speeds depending on location, but it was in practice in some areas as early as 1865. For black laborers, it offered the sort of autonomy that they craved. For white planters, it brought a level of stability to post-war plantation labor. In general, sharecropping reduced costs, minimized the sorts of interaction between employer and employee that led to conflict, all while incentivizing laborers to remain with a single employer until harvest time. Sharecropping, or cropping, may have been an improvement for some, but it was far from perfect. The ingrained prejudices of the planters against black self-management led to the same old conflicts. Couple that with the freedmen's protection of their autonomy and demand to be seen as, quote, partners in the crop, makes it clear that Southern labor relations had not progressed very far following emancipation. Even though it did not live up to Northern concepts of free labor, sharecropping seemed far enough removed from the coercive practices under slavery that blacks came to begrudgingly accept the system. In time, sharecropping and the related system of tenant farming became a key issue that drove the agrarian revolt, as a majority of black and white farmers fell into a predatory debt cycle under these systems. Next episode, we will continue our discussion of Reconstruction by shifting our focus to another player in post-war Southern society, the yeoman farmer. We will discuss some theories of just who these plain folk were and what type of relationship they had to the planter elite. After that, we will take a look at poor landless whites and how both lower classes of Southern whites reacted to secession and the Civil War in general. As always, thanks for listening, and until next time, this is Farmers Fight.